and that the particular things of this world participate in these forms, thus deriving their natures. So let's look at a couple examples. So far, this is all in the abstract, but I want to give you some definitions to work with. So let's take an example. Let's take a dog for a good example. All beagles, collies, hounds, terriers are called by the name dog. Now, you could have a particular collie, for example, that you and I have never seen before. However, when that particular collie is brought before our eyes, we immediately know that it's a dog. We know it's a dog and not a cat or an elephant or a human being. Now the question would be, how do we know that? Or more broadly speaking, I think we could ask, what is it that makes a dog and not a cat or an elephant or a human being? Well, for Plato, the answer to the question of what makes a dog would be the dog participates in the form of dogness, we could say. I'm not sure if that's a word or not, but we'll make one up for now. Dogness. So Plato thinks that there is an idea of what it means to be a dog. And each particular dog that we experience in this world participates in that idea, thus deriving its nature as a dog, and thus making it a dog and not a cat or an elephant or a human being. So when that particular collie that you and I have never experienced before, we've never seen it, maybe we go over to a friend's house and the friend just got a new dog, we've never seen the dog, but when the dog runs across the living room, we immediately know that it's a dog. We can recognize it because it participates in that form of dogness. Maybe dogginess would be a more appropriate word for it. But we know it's a dog because of the form that makes it a dog. So for Plato, the things of this world, not just dogs, but everything. A human being, for example, you and I, we're human beings and not dogs or cats or whatever animal you want to come up with. We're human beings because we partake of the form humanness. So think of the form humanness as the idea of a human being. Okay, so now remember, for Plato, these forms are not something that you can see. So if you're thinking of an image or a physical object when you're thinking of the form of humanness, for Plato, you're making a big mistake. Right? The form deals only with the abstract nature or the idea of a human being. Okay, thus each thing has a form making it the type of thing that it is. A chair, for example, possesses the form of chairness. And it is a chair because it partakes in that essence, in that form of what it is to be a chair. Right? And so on down the line. So this not only applies to humans, but it applies to trees. So think of all the different types of trees there are. We got pines, maples, oaks, etc., etc. All of them are called by the name tree, and for Plato, they all share a singular or a single form, thus making them a tree and not a plant or not a flower, for example. So the forms for Plato will play a very big role in his metaphysics. The forms are what is most real for Plato. So if we're going to know reality, if we're going to understand the world we live in, We don't want to spend all of our time focused on particular trees. We want to try to understand the idea of a tree. Or more simply, we want to understand the form of a tree. We want to understand the nature of treeness itself. So along the lines with forms are universals, that which pertains to an entire class of things, rather than a partial or particular, or a general concept common to a number of particulars. And we've looked at that example, pines, maples, oaks. So all that this is saying is that we can make a distinction between a particular pine tree and the universal concept of a tree. Okay, the universal is abstract, it's known through reason, whereas the particular pine tree, for example, is experienced through our senses. But we can also have universal ideas for more abstract concepts like justice, goodness, or beauty. And we'll come back to this concept of goodness later on in this lecture. As you know from the reading, it plays a very important role in Plato's Metaphysics. In conclusion, we can say for Plato and the school of philosophy that developed after him, known as Platonists, the forms are universal entities. So the form itself is universal in that it applies to all examples of it. So the form of a tree is universal in that the form of treeness is that which gives each particular tree its nature, making it a tree. Okay, so let's turn now to a couple examples that Plato gives in the reading for this week. The reading for this week comes from the Republic. Remember, this is one of Plato's philosophical dialogues. Socrates is the main character in the dialogue. He's having a discussion with several interlocutors over the nature of justice. And about midway through the dialogue, Socrates gives a series of, examples to explain this idea of the good. So they've really ascended from pursuing justice, or the question, what is justice, to the question of the good. And to make a long story short, Socrates ultimately argues that the good supersedes justice, or the good transcends justice itself. So the conversation really at this point in the Republic begins to take a new turn, going from a discussion of justice to a discussion of the good. And Socrates, in order to make this clear to his interlocutors, in particular Glaucon, Plato's brother, he uses three different images, we could say. The analogy of the sun, the divided line, and the famous allegory of the cave. So real quick, let's start with the analogy of the sun. So this is intended to be not something literal, but it's an analogy. It's intended to point to something beyond itself. What Socrates is doing here is he's making a comparison between the physical sun that we experience in the world and the idea of the good. And he argues that there are three things needed to see in order to utilize the faculty of sight. Well, number one, first we need to have the sense of sight. Two, we have to have color. And three, we need light itself. It's impossible, Plato argues, for one to see anything if any one of these three things are lacking. If one doesn't have sight, color, and light, it's impossible to see. Well, he also argues that there are three things needed to know something. We have to have an intellect, which would be the mind. We have to have ideas, but we also have to have the good itself. Okay, the good itself. The sun is the ultimate source of both light and life in the physical world. Likewise, the good, or the idea of the good, is the ultimate source of intellectual light and spiritual life in the world of ideas. So remember here, he's making a comparison between the physical world, and he's building on experiences that we have of the physical world to shed light on this real world of being. And Plato's arguing that in the real world of being, the idea of the good reigns supreme. Okay, and as you know from the reading, he says such things as the good gives the intellect the power to know. Thus, without the good itself, the idea of the good, one would never have the power to know anything. He also argues that the good is the cause of knowledge and truth. Thus, our pursuit of truth and our pursuit of knowledge would be impossible without the idea of the good. In addition, he states that the good is more beautiful than knowledge and truth, and higher than the form of justice. So we can think of this as a hierarchy. There's a hierarchy of forms for Plato, with the good being on top. Okay, so the good is that which causes knowledge and truth, but the idea of the good is also more beautiful than knowledge and truth. And finally, Plato states that the good is the source of being itself, or the source of existence or reality itself, but the idea of the good is beyond being itself. Now that's kind of confusing, so let's back up here one step. Plato is arguing that the idea of the good is the source of existence, the ground, you could say, or the foundation for existence, but it itself is beyond being. It's not limited to being itself. It somehow transcends being. Okay, now that's good metaphysical discussion right there. The main point to take